everybody. In today's video, we are going to explore a really important part of Pete Walker's book, which is titled Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving. Today, we are going to be talking about an incredibly damaging manifestation that happens to someone with Cptsd. Today, we are talking about what Pete Walker describes as the inner critic. What exactly is the inner critic, and how and why does it manifest in people who have been exposed to long-term narcissistic abuse and have developed Cptsd? If you're new to my channel, I would like to take a moment and welcome you and invite you to please subscribe and be sure and hit that notification bell because I put out new videos every week. Also, if you are interested in private one-on-one narcissistic abuse recovery coaching with me, please visit my website or send me an email. Both are linked in the description below. Okay, today we're talking about a symptom manifestation that happens very often in people who have developed Cptsd. Today we're talking about the inner critic. So what exactly is the inner critic? First, let's start by explaining the three different parts to the psyche as defined by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. They are called the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the instinctual component for the personality that is present at birth and the source of bodily needs and wants, emotional impulses and desires, especially aggression and the libido or sex drive. The id acts according to the pleasure principle and is unconscious by definition. The ego is the organized part of the personality structure that includes defensive, perceptual, intellectual, cognitive, and executive functions. Conscious awareness resides in the ego and it seeks to please the id's drive in realistic ways. The ego separates what is real and what is not, and it helps us to organize our thoughts and make sense of them and the world around us. Next is the superego and the part of the psyche that the development of the inner critic will come from. The superego reflects rules, mainly taught by parents applying their guidance and influence. And the simplest way I look at the superego is as our conscience. The superego is what keeps the id and the ego in line and is developed in childhood. For those of us who have been raised by a narcissistic parent and who have been exposed to narcissistic abuse their entire lives, this is incredibly problematic. Pete Walker describes the inner critic as the superego gone bad. He further explains the inner critic is the superego in overdrive, desperately trying to win your parents' approval. The way I look at the inner critic is that it is a deformed superego that has become intertwined with our identity. It's developed and born because of traumatic upbringings and living in abusive environments. The environment of the traumatic household acclimatizes the child's superego to danger and conditions them into seeking perfection. It is a defense mechanism and our response to parents who do not give their approval, essentially. So what happens is the child who is exposed to narcissistic abuse, to the abandonment, to the neglect, to the abuse, internalizes their abuser's voice. The internal dialogue we have with ourselves becomes as critical and disapproving as their parents has been. Unfortunately, we will believe that inner critic is actually us and that it is giving us an accurate understanding of who we are and who we are not, which in reality could not be further from the truth. And this is one of the major reasons why when a victim gets away from their abuser, that they do not get better, because they are continuing to abuse themselves in their own mind and believe the destructive and shame-driven narrative that the inner critic is telling them. We don't understand that the voice is our abuser and that it is a liar and that its job is to wreck our self-esteem, just like the abusive narcissistic parent wanted to do. So now let's get into some of the specific and most common inner critic attacks that someone with CPTSD will experience based on Pete Walker's book, and some of the self-affirmations we can use to overpower the inner critic's position. Perfectionism. We must respond to our inner critic's need for perfectionism by explaining that perfection is only a myth and that we have a right to make mistakes, as does everyone. All or nothing, black or white thinking. When our inner critic seeks overgeneralized ideas or judgments, we must respond by reminding ourselves that these extremes are completely unrealistic. Self-hatred and toxic shame, our response to these negative emotions must be furious and committed. We must defend ourselves against our inner critic as we would one of our friends, children, or loved ones. So how do we get control over the inner critic and start to accept and understand that the narrative the critic is feeding us is not true, is not accurate, and in fact is indeed abusive? The first step is understanding that the inner critic is not actually you. It's your abuser. And the inner critic's desires are basically the exact same as your abuser, which is to destroy your self-esteem, destroy your sense of self, and to rob you of your God-given birthright to live your life free from abuse and trauma. And the only way to stop the critic is to confront it. Pete Walker mentions in his book that we need to treat our inner critic like a schoolyard bully, and we must fight back. Personally, I went even further than that. I would do visualizations where I destroyed the inner critic. I did them over and over and over until the critic was gone. And if and when I hear the inner critic revealing itself, I immediately identify and acknowledge that this is the inner critic. I tell the critic that it is no longer welcome to rent space in my head, and that I will not under any circumstances adopt the abusive and phony narrative it is trying to feed me. And if you will do this religiously every single time the inner critic rears its ugly, lying, abusive head, eventually it will shrink and shrink until one day it will be gone. I cannot emphasize enough how critically important it was that I address and eliminate that inner critic from my life. In my opinion, that inner critic is more dangerous and damaging than every narcissist in the world. And as I mentioned before, all of us, every single one of us, has a God-given birthright to live a life free of abuse. And that includes any abuse that we are subjecting ourselves to in the form of the inner critic. Okay, that's going to do it for today's video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. Also, follow me on my other social media platforms. They're all linked in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone.